Phil is the CISO and Vice President of Google Cloud, where he leads the risk, security, compliance, and privacy teams. He oversees a team of security industry experts and leaders in the Google Cloud office, and they partner with customers on their secure digital transformations. Prior to Google Cloud, Phil was a partner at Goldman Sachs, where he held multiple roles over a long career, initially as CISO, a role that he held for over 17 years. With that, I'd like to welcome Phil to kick things off. Phil.
Thank you, Michelle. Great to be here. So I'm going to go through a few slides fairly quickly, then we can get to the Q&A, and then the panel where we can cover anything that you would like, either based on this content or in fact, anything else in the wide world of cybersecurity. So really, what I'm going to cover today is just an overview of what we're seeing are the major strategic trends on cyber and what are some of the tactical impacts from that. When we think about the strategic trends, and this may be a strange thing to kick off what is ostensibly a cybersecurity presentation with, is it's worth reminding ourselves that cybersecurity is not the only technology risk. In fact, most organizations, as I think all of you will probably appreciate, have multiple different types of technology risks. It could be resiliency issues, it could be software development risks in terms of is the code working, it could be privacy risks, it could be capacity issues. There's a whole spectrum of technology risks to mitigate, one of which is cybersecurity or information security in general. And the reason I make this point, as you'll probably see on some of the things I'm going to talk about, is it's important to mitigate cybersecurity risk not on its own, but as part of an overall technology architecture that embeds multiple different types of risk mitigation and is designed with security embedded in the environment. And in fact, as I think a lot of you probably appreciate, a lot of the best cybersecurity controls also mitigate many other risks, and there's an increasing alignment between security and many other aspects of how an effective, agile, and controlled IT environments should operate. And so when we look at these strategic trends, a lot of them are through that broad lens. So the first is we see many more companies focused heavily on how to think about not just software security, but software security and reliability. So integrating security very closely into the development process and thinking about security as one of many quality objectives as part of the overall software pipeline and software development lifecycle in an organization. And this increasingly includes, as we'll have all seen in the past year, management of software supply chain risks, especially security risk, and not just on third-party software, but also as part of how you're managing the overall open source ecosystem in your environment. And more this kind of objective of secure, software security and reliability come together. And from what we see, the organizations that do this best are ones that do integrate security closely into the development lifecycle, and so-called, as the phrase goes, shift it left more and more, not just in the tool chain, but in the minds of the developers and how software is specified. The second piece is really an important thing, is to increasingly focus on how to make security usable and how to embed control in the environment such that you get what you might call ambient control. We also call it in Google Cloud what we call invisible security, in that it's ever present and there, but you don't necessarily have to interact with it all the time. One of the things, again, that we see that differentiates companies that do really well on security is they think through not just how to implement security for their customers, users, employees, developers, engineers, business professionals. They think about how to make it useful and compatible with people's roles, and not necessarily visible unless it absolutely needs to be visible. And again, I think this is another approach that we see many companies starting to take. The third piece, again, is important on what we might call continuous control monitoring. And this is reflective of the fact, and again, I think a lot of you will appreciate this, is most times when you see whether a company that's had a security breach or some other type of incident, it's not because they didn't think to have a control to mitigate that risk. Often the common pattern of many of these events is the control they thought they had that would have defended against the attack for some reason wasn't working when they needed it most, or a patch had not been applied, or some network port had been inadvertently left open, or some other part of their control apparatus that was supposed to be there was just missing at the time it was most needed. And you can imagine in many of these organizations, the post-mortem will go along the form of, how did this happen? And then somebody said, well, 3 weeks earlier we did this change and this control got switched off and nobody checked and it didn't get switched back on, and then lo and behold we had an incident. And so this is why continuous control monitoring, in other words, continuously looking for whether your controls are deployed where they need to be and that they're operating effectively, and that you're constantly looking for whether controls are in fact operational. And if they're not, to manage a control incident as a first-class object, just like you would manage a security incident, becomes again ever more critical, especially in large, complex environments where you've just got many, many different control instances across the environment. The fourth one is operational resilience. Again, this is another big strategic trend we see across many organizations, and this is more than just a fancy way of talking about disaster recovery and business resilience. This is more taking a much more business service centric view of resilience, recovery, security, and making sure that an organization is more consciously planning for how to operate in adversity, as opposed to just having a binary on off in terms of resilience. And again, this could be the subject of a whole presentation in its own right, but I definitely encourage people to look up some of the work that's going on around operational resilience. And then the fifth main element is something we talk about in terms of adjacent benefits, which is real leading edge security teams in organizations, and not just, and I say just because the job is hard enough, but not just doing like the first four things. They're also in all of their control work looking for opportunities to improve customer experience, reduce friction in how processes work. So in other words, they're not just delivering great security, they're delivering security that also adds a significant amount of business value. And that in turn drives up the business or mission sponsor for kind of for public sector organizations engagement in the security mission. And again, this is all about thinking about what other benefits security can provide. Now, all of these things are really hard to do, and this is, I'm not going to try and make this a pitch for Google Cloud, especially, but most organizations can't do this on their own. They need to make appropriate use of suppliers, whether it's cloud providers, SaaS providers, other types of vendors that support them. And an increasing kind of strategy and a great trend to see is organizations do well when they manage and appropriately manage their selection of suppliers to deliver the best of these things to support them in their mission. So, when you go to the next level of detail, beyond these trends, what are some of the tactics of how we deal with some of the pressing issues? So again, none of this will come as a surprise to this audience, but some of the big pressing issues all companies are dealing with is making sure you've got high assurance ransomware mitigation, managing a secure and safe transition to the cloud and other external services, while still managing the risks of the legacy tail that may not be ready to be re-architected for the cloud. Managing software supply chain risk and open source risk, which we talked about, and then ongoing careful management of making sure that you're staying on top of insider threats and various other internal risks that may occur, and all while balancing the appropriate degree of security and business agility. So a lot of the tactics that come from this, and again, I think this group especially will be familiar with a lot of these, is driving a zero trust architecture, not just for zero trust in the form of kind of user remote access or employee remote access, but also zero trust for production. And the way to think about zero trust is it's not a term I'm necessarily a fan of. I mean, it's kind of coined after a lot of we in the industry were building anyway. But the way to kind of think about zero trust really is no implicit trust. And so the classic example is, if you're on a corporate network, you have a lot of access to everything, whether you should have that or not, based on the integrity of your machine. And then and so that gives you a lot of implicit trust. Removing implicit trust means you strongly authenticate the user, you validate the machine, and you do that continuously. And then you mediate only the amount of access that that explicit verification of trust merits. And then similarly in the production environment, and we've, as Google, have encoded these in what we call Beyond Corp and Beyond Prod. And if you Google those, there's plenty of white papers that describe that in detail. But essentially the production environment of fine-grained segmentation between applications and application processes mutually authenticating each other to validate trust, that with the end user zero trust environment creates a very strong layered defense, which mitigates a lot of the things we've talked about. The second tactic is really that what we mentioned before on continuous control monitoring, which is how do you get real-time risk transparency. And then third, really focusing on investments where you can apply some leverage. The goal of all of us, I think, is to keep raising the baseline level of control across the environment. And nobody has, despite the prioritization, nobody has infinite budgets to spend on cybersecurity. So the more you can reduce the unit cost of a particular control by commoditizing how it works, by embedding it in the environment, by requiring that you buy and deliver secure products rather than products that you have to bake security in after the fact. The more you can do that, the more you reduce your unit cost of control, and the more you can raise your baseline everywhere. And so viewing this as a game of economics, of how you not just drive down costs to save money, but drive down the unit cost of control so you can put more and better controls in more places. That's the way we ultimately be better defenders. And then related to that, just the workforce challenge. A lot of organizations correctly talk about the difficulty of hiring and finding more qualified cybersecurity professionals. And there's talk of all of the millions of unfilled job roles and missing cybersecurity professionals. That's true, and it's obviously important that we all keep investing in developing new talent and investing in our education systems and other professional development to grow the cybersecurity workforce. But it kind of misses at the additional point, which in many respects is even more important, which is we've got to 10x the productivity of the people we've already got. And so investing in automation, tooling, various different approaches to look at the individual jobs of cybersecurity professionals in our organizations and looking at how we can 10x their productivity to get more out of the people we've got using the appropriate tools is absolutely crucial. And the great thing about doing that as well is often in our experience, when we've done that inside Google, we've also made people's jobs better, so they're more likely to stay and more likely to be energized and working on the real value add things. And then finally, the big tactic as well, which again, I think this audience will be well practiced at, is taking a view of threat-informed defenses. So having an awareness of the threats, the evolution of the tools, techniques, and practices that the threat actors use, and making sure that we're not just mitigating particular tactics, but we're seeking mitigations that defeat whole classes of attacks over time. And that's the way we stay ahead of the threat. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. The point that this slide is for our, for all of the work you will all do with boards and executive leadership in organizations is to help boards and executive leaders who are not necessarily technology experts, let alone cybersecurity experts, is have them kind of think through what's the best way they can oversee this risk. And really the way to think about that is, this is highlighted in yellow, is just thinking about what the most important assets and business services are, what risks face those assets and services, and what controls mitigate those risks. And then thinking, are those controls, as we mentioned before, continuously measured as operating within expectations? And for whatever residual risk remains, who at what level in the organization has accepted that? And then how frequently is all this assessed? Now, you'll notice in that paragraph, we don't mention technology or cybersecurity once, because this is just the standard way boards and executives think about all of their other strategic business risk. And clearly, the more we can position cyber as a strategic business risk, a first class risk alongside all of those other enterprise risks, then the more this can be embedded and managed and supported and overseen by the board and executive leadership in the appropriate ways. And you know, there's some examples there where boards can be engaged on risk limits, scenario analysis, looking through incident and close call analysis, driving the business line ownership of risk with the CISO organization in support. And then again, as we've talked about over the past few slides, recognizing and driving the importance of technology modernization and not just investing in cyber, but investing in modernizing the IT environment that embeds a new level of defensible architecture within that. And so, you know, when you think about all of this, the real determinant of success for most organizations just comes down to speed. So it's the speed of which they can upgrade their environment to a more modern IT architecture. It's the speed of taking updates from a cloud provider, a service provider, IT vendors, and applying those security enhancements or those updates. It's the speed of giving employees and customers improved capabilities from your environment. It's the speed of not necessarily eliminating legacy. Sometimes legacy systems are perfectly fine. It's when they become stagnant and unmaintained that they're an issue. So it's eliminating stagnant systems and wrapping legacy systems with some protective layers so that they can function within the new, more modern technology architecture. And then finally, that whole speed of the so-called OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, act loop of how to respond to threats and upgrade the environment. Now, many organizations today clearly are not going to be, you know, high speed at every one of these things, but the thing to strive towards, and what we see in working with organizations that are doing this well across this spectrum of things, they're getting faster and faster and faster all the time. And I think, as you know, it may seem challenging, but you know, this is the challenge that we all have to keep getting faster at dealing with these things. You know, when we think, and this is kind of slightly a bit of a pitch for Google Cloud, you know, but you could, you know, to be fair to our wonderful competition out there, you could also say the same thing for some of the other hyperscale cloud providers. Is, you know, the great thing about the cloud, and especially for Google Cloud, where we've really designed security in from the very beginning, is a lot of these attributes you get at scale at increasing speed. And it's largely because of just the scale we operate that we're able to embed a degree of control in the environment, whether it's through our proprietary hardware with our embedded security chips, encryption by default in transit and and at rest across the entire environment, plus even things now like confidential compute, where we're able to encrypt data all the way up to the point of processing inside a secure enclave in the processor, and all of the other stuff we do on the software stack. So all of this together means that the cloud, and from our perspective, Google Cloud, increasingly helps organizations drive all of the stuff we just talked about at scale and speed. And then as well, it's important to keep investing. So many of you will have seen this. So we committed a few weeks ago as part of a White House announcement, was, you know, that we're investing another $10 billion over the next few years to expand all the stuff we're doing on zero trust, all the work we're doing across industry on enhancing the security of the software supply chain, and especially all the stuff that we're doing on open source software security. And I'd encourage everybody out there to take a look at the Open Source Security Foundation, and, you know, and if you can sign up to it. You know, there's different levels of membership, but, you know, it's really important that we all collectively help drive the security of the open source community, the open source projects that we all utilize either through service providers or directly in our environment. And this is why we co-founded that organization and have been investing very heavily in supporting open source and making sure the open source projects that we all use are effectively secured and managed. And that's one of the big reasons for driving that. And then finally, you may have seen recent announcements is, we recently formed in Google this thing we call our cybersecurity action team. And this is an integrated organization made up of many of our customer engineering security specialists, security solutions specialists, all of the people in our cloud CISO organization, all of our trust and compliance teams, all coming together in this one integrated unit to deliver support for customers around helping them reconfigure themselves to make most secure use of the cloud, figuring out how to sustain regulatory compliance, working out how to engineer a secure cloud environment, and then partnering with us on drilling and practicing for incident response. And so this is an even bigger part of our effort to kind of bring more of Google security, not just in cloud, but all of Google to, not just our customers, but to the world at large. So you'll see more from us on that. And a lot of what we do in this is colored by these kind of strategic trends and tactics I talked about. So with that, I'll close. I'm happy to take questions, and I think we're also going to have questions in a panel format as well. So I'll hand back to Michelle.
At this point, why don't I invite the other panelists to join us? Kelly, Vince, great, thank you. Thank you, Phil. That was a great overview. Can I ask the additional panelists to introduce themselves? Why don't we start with you, Kelly?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. Hi, I'm Kelly Ueoka. I'm the president and CEO of a locally based systems integrator technology firm called Pacxa.
Great, thank you. Vince?
Morning, afternoon. My name is Vince Hoang, and I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the state of Hawaii. Our office agency is the Enterprise Technology Services. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Cybersecurity is such a huge topic. If I didn't have my own CISO, what 3 areas would you ask? What would your recommendation be on areas to focus on for maybe smaller organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I can probably kick off on that. I mean, again, I almost hesitate to say it because it sounds so self-serving given where I work, but I think for small and medium-sized organizations, it's just, I don't think it makes sense to even try to do this yourself. There's many good service providers out there that you can just get somebody else to manage this for you. And again, if I was from Microsoft, I'd be talking about Office 365, but I'm not, so I'll talk about Google. So again, Google, we actually just announced a thing called Google WorkSafer, which is a packaging together of Google Workspace, which is like Gmail, Drive, Meet, collaboration tools, plus a whole bunch of security tools that are connected together with it, like security authentication keys and various other different kind of tools from some partners. So you can just sign up and just get this kind of end-to-end integrated package. And then, especially if you're then using managed devices like a Chromebook or something else, there's not a lot you just have to do other than just kind of switch it on and like not turn off the updates, and you're going to get like a high degree of protection. And so definitely, unless you've got an IT department, I think the only way of doing it really is to kind of sign up to a reputable service provider that will kind of wrap some protection around what your business or other activities are.
Great, thanks.
I can jump in a little bit and expand on that. If you're a really small organization, you can't even afford IT people. I mean, focus on the basics, like that's been highlighted, like from your mobile devices, for example. These days, you just leave it on and update it overnight. You go to bed and wake up and you key in your PIN code again, and it just works. If you had these mobile devices 10 years ago, it was a much bigger level of effort. So you've seen that the private industry has helped modernize and made security infrastructure a lot simpler to manage, and with a goal of becoming as frictionless as possible. Aligning really well with what Phil mentioned earlier about making security controls transparent. So the simplest thing is with your devices, just keep patching them. The most actionable item that you can really do to help protect yourself is enabling your all your logins for MFA, whether you would call it two-step or multi-factor, what have you. Is that anything that's potentially exposed to the internet, you want to lock in those controls so that you have protections. If you're just basic SMS controls, for example, will be good enough to be able to address most of your use case. If you have higher level controls, then use authenticators like on your mobile app. And if you're really, really concerned about security, migrate towards actual physical tokens for controls. And so whether or not you're part of the Google Gmail infrastructure ecosystem or on the Microsoft side, both of those major email platforms, for example, are enabling and moving you towards those pieces. In fact, I think earlier this month, Google, for just Gmail, for your free email account, they normalized two-step authentication just by default. You know, you're not going to have the option of just using a plain password anymore. So that's where our private sector is helping us as an industry as a whole, help moving that dial and getting us closer to secure baselines.
And I couldn't have said it better. I mean, between the two of you, you know, the technology enablement that you can achieve by looking at cloud, and then also partnering, Michelle, because of the nature, you know, of IT in Hawaii and the small business sector. There's not a whole bunch of SIs that you can choose from, you know, in Hawaii that have the expertise where you can defer and say, hey, take care of my IT for me. And even at that, if you did that, you know, there's also a measure of security versus productivity, right? So I think Phil commented on it earlier, you know, in terms of zero trust. I certainly, I mean, we want to be able to implement something like that, but it won't be that. And like, you know, another comment was there's not an unlimited IT budget. In fact, some folks barely have budget at all. So I think, you know, good points. The MFA thing, yeah, it's been working out for us in terms of the customers we serve to protect them with these basic security controls, whether it be, you know, in anybody's or in any of the leading edge cloud providers, and of course with Google being one of the best. You know, it's really helpful for us as well to be able to help our customers that, again, you know, are in a tough situation, quite frankly. And this, you know, it hurts me to see, you know, local businesses getting affected by ransomware. I mean, we've had instances where, you know, operations have stopped because they get something as simple as clicking on an email phish. So yeah, I think the point being, you know, there's a lot of information out there. To Phil's point, hey, look at engaging a provider to help you deal with this, because nobody will know everything. And again, the limited, you know, the limited pool of SIs in Hawaii, and then also budget constraints can certainly be a risk that we need to address.
Great, thank you. How do I move an organization towards zero trust if, you know, a lot of our organizations have aging infrastructure and legacy apps?
Yeah, I mean, I think in our experience, you know, you have to do a little bit of upgrading, but the good news is there's a lot of products and services out there that can kind of take you on the journey in stages. So, you know, and again, if we just talk about user access to the environment in zero trust ways, where you're connecting in and the user's more strongly authenticated, the device is integrity checked, and then people's access is directed according to their job role and the degree of which the device and the person is authenticated. You can buy various products, you know, we sell them. There's other companies like, you know, Netscope and Zscaler and others that you know, sell, you know, cloud-based services that let you get up and running on that relatively quickly, and then to phase it in across your employees. So that's relatively more attainable in stages. And again, you can deploy that, and then having deployed it, tighten up the security policies over time, as opposed to doing it in a big bang. The more kind of zero trust for production, where you're segmenting applications and data and production services, that can be more challenging. But again, there's ways of doing that in coarse-grained ways that you then get more and more fine-grained as you implement a more modern application architecture. But certainly, in all of those things, you can do it in phases.
Thank you.
I can reflect on a little bit on how the state of Hawaii is doing it. I feel that we're going to forever be in a hybrid mode where we have a mix of on-premises systems are actually physical devices, on-premises virtual systems, and moving more towards cloud native infrastructures and platforms. So as far as moving towards modernization, I would say identify small systems first that can be cloud native out the gate. So if your organization able to figure out a single sign-on model, you can very, very quickly and safely connect into cloud-enabled systems and help drive the business forward there. On the legacy side, I try my best to look at these as opportunities, meaning that if something's decades old, we need to do a business assessment and saying, well, if we've done a process for so long already, what can we do to not only modernize the technology, but how we solve those business solutions as well. In short, let's replace that legacy application and move towards systems that can keep up to date now, that are more mobile friendly and more accessible and can be actionable. In the middle ground are going to be systems that we're not going to be able to deprecate soon. So much of these zero trust models allow for application security gateways, so that we can tie in stronger authentication and then still access this older environment to help give us a bridge until we can modernize, replace that application itself.
Yeah, I would concur. It's to implement a zero trust approach. It's going to be something that you work on over time. Hybrid is definitely here to stay. I mean, like Vince described, probably every other organization around Hawaii will be in a hybrid mode for the foreseeable future. However, in this move to the cloud, again, with the industry leading, vendors such like Microsoft and Google, it really does make it a lot easier, especially for SIs, because a lot of the framework has already been built. And I don't pretend like we can build something better than, Microsoft or Google or AWS for that matter. So, there was this executive order, put out by the government, the federal government, that called out for some specific steps to take in terms of modernization around cybersecurity to help protect all of us, and for them, and like we already talked about, multi-factor authentication, things like application secure gateways for end-to-end encryption of, data in transit, etc., can all help. But again, it boils down to what can we really afford to do? Yeah. So I think I heard Vince mention a business assessment for something more tactical with legacy application evaluation, and if it can be ported to a more modern framework. But from where I sit, and because we serve the small to large organizations alike, I think a business assessment in terms of technology footprint is applicable most times. And it comes back to what Phil presented on. Cyber is a whole different way of thinking, to protect ourselves in this day and age. So
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So I admitted at the beginning of this call that I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but it sounds like if I use the right tools, I want to say abdicate, but it's not. As a developer, we used to just abdicate it to our information security officer and to the security group. Is that the key?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways of thinking about cloud in general is it's almost becoming like a digital immune system, in that, you know, when you think about all of the big cloud providers, we're pushing out hundreds of new security features, and you know, these are not just like bug fixes, these are like new features, new controls, new ways of doing things, and there's hundreds of these things come out each month. And you think about like what causes that to happen. You know, we have very large security teams, you know, like thousands of security engineers and researchers and others that are always thinking about ways of improving the platform. Then, you know, then we've got all of our own people and our, you know, third-party companies that run tests against the platform, that find issues that we then fix. And then we've got pretty big public bug bounty and vulnerability discovery programs. And then we've got tens of thousands of customers, some of which are some of the world's largest organizations that have their own pretty elite security teams that are constantly pushing us to add more features. So basically, you know, if you're an organization that has no or a small security team, and as I mentioned before, if you just kind of sit back and take every update that comes at you, you're almost like tapping into like all of that world of security expertise without having to have it. If you just take every update, and I think if the only thing you can get good at is finding the right service provider to use and taking every update they give you, then it's almost like, you know, kind of a rising tide lifts all boats. You're going to be in relatively good shape, and then you can just focus on running your business, performing the mission of your organization. The only thing you really have to be careful of is some of the settings on these things. And you know, I can't remember if it was Vincent or Kelly, you know, reminded us, you know, we've been rolling this out at Google, is switching on higher levels of default controls. And you know, sometimes like customers take that and then they switch it back off because they just can't, you know, they don't want the inconvenience. But generally, we're trying to ship more and more things with like full safeties on, so even the small businesses, individual users don't even have to think to switch a security feature on. And, you know, and again, they can always turn them off if it's inconvenient. But I think it's largely the responsibility of service providers to ship more and more with full safeties on to drive that behavior. And again, if you're a small business or an individual, just taking every update, and every time the service provider says, switch on this feature or don't switch this thing off that we've just enabled for you, then recognize that there's probably a pretty good reason for that. And you may want to take the advice, given that we're supporting and protecting about 4 billion people. So, you know, we see a lot of bad stuff every day, and figure out how to protect people from those things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. The unique access to some of the, you know, the data that is more prevalent in terms of cybersecurity risk. And, you know, firms like Google having access to that really does lend a light. And to Phil's point, it's become evident that the old paradigm of building an impenetrable fortress for what you have, you know, on premises prior to the cloud wave is no longer realistic. And you know, as people start to move, especially for the small to mid market, and then again, especially for customers in Hawaii, you know, having everything on at, you know, out of the box is the new approach. Whereas before, you know, we would go up the chain and enable things because, you know, it would just get shut off. It would be too, quote unquote, it would impede the ability for them to almost do business at times, right? But it's become a reality. And you can ask those that have had ransomware cripple their business, where their philosophy has changed, I mean, overnight. And so I think a lot of other businesses are trying to learn, hey, we don't want to get stuck in this situation. So, you know, what do you do? And, you know, again, not to sound self-serving, but yes, engaging a good systems integrator or service provider is probably the way to go. And at the very minimum, if you can become an expert in working with a good SI, that's a first hurdle overcome.
I absolutely love this part of the conversation by leaning on various partners. For me, I have a soft spot about the secure baselines here, whatever platform we use. For me as a customer, I'm trying to echo the requirement or the need of safe defaults or sane defaults, where it's locked down out the gate. Leave it up to the customer to say, no, I risk accept and I want to open this hole rather than leaving it wide open in the first place. A part of the reason why ransomware and phishing is such a predominant issue on a global scale right now is because of the business drivers of making connectivity sooner. If there were better ways of getting business to accept that out the box, it's going to be safe. And while if you need to integrate and make things work, you intentionally relax these controls. And by relaxing the controls, it is an intentional risk acceptance. I think the middle road to this is by leading our providers to actually provide measurements to us, meaning that if I intentionally disable MFA, for example, then when I log to the console, there should be a really obnoxious warning screen. It's like, hey, you have MFA disabled. That's a risk. And just be on the side there calling out that that's an issue rather than requiring the customer to dive deep into the documentation. It's like, oh yeah, we don't have MFA enabled. I'm hoping we're, given what's been happening, especially on the ransomware side, is that we're able to reverse that trend, and so that as customers, we actually want these same defaults in the beginning. I'm hoping it becomes a feature more than a second thought, that as you sign up as a customer, when signing up for more services, intentionally ask what security controls are in place, what can be enabled in the very beginning to help keep me safe.
Okay, thank you. So I used to work at banks, and they used to have different things like training and clean desk policy and all of those things on the pre-side. What you guys are talking about is the system, and then there's the post if there is an issue. If you look at the time organizations spend on all of those, where's the focus? The education and the clean desk policy type stuff and the test tax and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think kind of education and training is important, but I think there's some aspects of things where I think we shouldn't reasonably expect end users or even our customers to be like a line of defense. And like the classic example is, is phishing and educating people not to click on links. The reality of most people's jobs is clicking on links, right? And so and some of the phishing attacks are so good, it's hard to expect people, no matter what amount of training you put them through, that they're not eventually going to make a mistake. And if your organization is like one employee's one click away from disaster, then you've probably got to question where your other control investments should be. So, that's just kind of one extreme example. That for things like that, I think while it's useful to educate employees about the risk, I don't necessarily think you should always educate them on necessarily how to be a line of defense for those things if you're investing in protecting them from those threats. I think you have to educate them so that they work with your defenses and not try to circumvent them. But I think whenever you're kind of educating employees to be like their activities would be a crucial part of defense, you've also got to think about what else you can put in place to help mitigate that risk. The other classic example you see a lot of is that around business email compromise, where CFOs are duped into a fake email from the CEO dupes the CFO into making a payment, and you think, well, okay, we could educate everybody about not to be duped on email, but perhaps the other way of doing it is to just institute a policy where you never act on email instructions and you have a separate authentication mechanism, just like you would find in corporate cash management systems. But generally speaking, I think it's important to overall embed training in business processes so that the business process is aligned with what the right defenses are. Similarly, with kind of educating software developers, you could send software developers on months and months or years and years of development training on how to build secure software, or for 95% of the common vulnerability classes, you could give them some API and some toolkits so that they don't repeatedly make those patterns. And then for what remains, you could use various different tools that are available to constantly analyze their code in their development environment and flash up warnings along with little kind of education vignettes about what they've just done, is a more effective training embedded in the process rather than bringing people separately to the training. So I think training is important, but it's never a substitute for embedding control in your environment.
Oh, that was very, very well said. Yes, security awareness training is a catch-22 for us. One, we recognize it is a requirement, but there are depreciating returns because most of the training that's available out there, they're a little bit costly, and quite frankly, they're boring. So we need to recognize that we have at least established as baseline, but and provide, like Phil said, provide better business outcomes. One approach that we've tried to do here, the state is in the past, we would encourage users if they see a suspicious email that looked like a more adversarial and not spam, but more as a phish, then report it to our SOC mailbox. So we started educating people. It's like, hey, there's a feedback loop here. If you see something suspicious, call us or forward that email so we can do some analysis. That was several years back, and the time to response, for example, was hours to days in that type of volume. In the past year, we actually modernized it a little bit, where embedding a report phish button into the mail client. And what this does is, I'm trying to upsell the term, is a fast feedback. Rather than having the users forward the mail to the SOC and waiting hours or days, they will get instant feedback with less than a minute by an automated analysis that say, hey, was this a simulated phish that we're actually testing you to make sure you're not clicking on suspicious links, or if it is something that we should be analyzing. So if it's something that needs additional triage or analysis by our team, there will be a response immediately saying, hey, we're going to follow up with you if necessary. And then that helps close the loop. So the intent is provide better business outcomes by, at least with the security controls, for the most part, making it frictionless and transparent to the user. But in certain cases, like the phish reporting, provide feedback as close and quickly to the user as possible to help encourage them to want to do it. Because if they're just kind of forward a message and then they don't get a response, or it takes days, they're going to be less inclined to actually work with that system and provide that information.
Yeah, I mean, with the education part, it is, a nice to have if you can go through, and especially for the larger organizations, I'm sure they require their employees to have some kind of basic training around, especially around the phishing attacks. But again, you're as good as the platform security that you're using. For us, again, for the larger organizations, they're well on their way. But for the SMB, we've had to come up with some pretty creative ways, gamification of getting them to respond similarly to what Vince described in his process, is something that's been useful for us. But that's just us thinking outside the box, because again, they don't have the budget to, have it all. So it's a combination of both there, where we train them as best we can, but also give them the platform security that, can offer them some protection. So yeah, thanks.
You guys mentioned ransomware and phishing. What are the biggest threats facing orgs today? So you talked about what to do to prevent it, but what are the bigger ones, and are they going to be the same in 3 years? Do you see something else coming down the pipe?
Yeah, I mean, it's constantly evolving. I mean, kind of ransomware is getting a lot of headlines at the moment. I think that's obviously a clear and present danger for many organizations. I think there's a lot of other stuff happens in organizations like data theft, payments issues, a whole array of things, as well as what I said at the beginning, not just cybersecurity issues, but reliability and other types of risks as well. I think on the ransomware one, I think that's gonna keep challenging a lot of organizations until organizations have some, higher, more default defenses that can keep the ransomware actors out. But and then even if they get in, making sure that backups are more effective. Sadly, there's still a lot of organizations that only find out their backups are not effective at the moment they need them most after a ransomware event. And so we certainly spend a lot of time encouraging organizations to really test their backups in the way you would recover from a ransomware event, as opposed to what most organizations do today when they test their backup. They just test copying a file back and go, yeah, the file made it, backups are fine. Whereas, as I think this audience will know, when you're actually recovering from a ransomware event, it's almost like rebooting your company from backup tape or immutable disk, and that's a whole different proposition than how you more regularly use backups. And you find a lot of organizations, when they come to do that, they realize that critical bits of software weren't in the backups, the indexes for the backups weren't in the backups, and if that's wiped, they can't recover the there's loads and loads of stuff. So I think ransomware is going to keep going there. I think, as we've seen, software supply chain risks are going to keep happening. And again, I think there's going to be some risk where, particularly for larger organizations, when they're in the middle of transitioning from an on-premise environment to a cloud environment, making sure that they sustain the security of their old systems while they're moving to the new, and they don't neglect that, is going to continue to be important. But I think, the main thing is, it's just the good news is, well, it's not necessarily easy, but staying on top of a solid IT security baseline level of controls, like we've all talked about, and keeping that up to date, stands a chance of mitigating quite a lot of issues, whether it's malware, ransomware, data theft, even insider risks. It's having that base, evolving and increasing baseline level of control is, can defend against a lot of attacks. And so I think it's important to focus on some of the issues, but you don't design a security program just to mitigate ransomware. You design a security program to apply a high degree of control that can mitigate many different types of risk. And I think getting overly focused on one type of risk, may cause you to neglect all the other things you need to do.
Yeah, we're all familiar with that SolarWinds headline that made the news, and then the pipeline attack, and like Phil said, ransomware in the headlines. But I think what's happening out there is the human operated aspect of these types of attacks will just continue to be relentless. And it's not that the tools we have, again, provided by industry leaders like Google, Microsoft, AWS, etc., it isn't good. It's very good. So staying on top of that and watching what's out there, I think, is another, us as service providers being educated is important. But one of the other things that I'm seeing is that these human operated cells, that were responsible for some of the large scale attacks, are then spawning other partner, like quote unquote, partners that then come after smaller folks. And now they're coming after the SIs as well. I mean, we're seeing an uptick in our activity because, again, if we manage access and we actually build cybersecurity framework for some of our customers, for them to gain access to our infrastructure would be them gaining access to our customers' infrastructure. So it's ever, the investment we're making in cybersecurity and understanding, what's out there has become critical to our operation.
I'm chuckling a little bit about when Phil said, don't focus on ransomware. For my internal communications, I'm actually leveraging ransomware as a common, because it's buzzworthy and people are a little paying more attention. But under the hood, if you look under the program as a whole, it is establishing good, solid baseline controls. And our ability to respond to ransomware is a use case on how those baselines are being able to address it. And I definitely want to amplify what Kelly said about human operated. I think that is a concern. Human operated attacks, that's the area of concern that won't be changing overnight. I'm trying to run away from any vendor that says use machine learning and AI and solve your cybersecurity troubles. That is just really, really bad marketing to me. Where we can leverage machine learning and modern tools, at least from my perspective, it helps with the automation, both for good or for bad. And at least on the state infrastructure side, is we're trying to leverage modernization tools to help speed up our ability to respond to threats. And that means we automate away the easy stuff, and that way we have more time to focus on the hard stuff. This is not only cybersecurity focused, but with any line of business requirement. We want to leverage technologies to help enable a business. Right, so to reduce and minimize those redundant tasks so that our human operators, our actual assets, they're able to focus more on what is business critical. From the ransomware or the bad actor perspective, it would be the same thing. That as the threats evolve, it's because of the speed and automation to provide and amplify the easy stuff, but it's still the human operator at the other side of the keyboard. That's what the true threat is that we need to watch out for.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, for organizations that are maybe struggling to kind of prioritize implementing a lot of the controls, the ransomware threat is you're right, is a great call to action to focus people's attention. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And then I looked at our audience, and we have mixed audience, some that are experts and some that are less so. But for those who are interested in getting into cybersecurity, do you have any recommendations on where someone should start?
I think the good news these days is that there's quite a lot of choice. There's a lot of kind of certification style training for like the broad body of knowledge on information security, things like kind of various certifications like CISSP and CISM and various other certifications. There's also a lot of universities now have online certificate or degree programs that are available online and and can be done in parallel with work. They can stage out over multiple years, so you don't have to kind of quit your day job to do these things. And then also, like all of the cloud providers, we all have our own labs and certifications and other training courses. And so I think I don't think there's ever been, we're kind of spoiled for choice, if anything. But yeah, I think depending on what people's appetite and time is, there's lots of different options.
That's good. That's the paradox of choice.
That's right.
Yes, I recall trying to cut my teeth in this industry, and it was considerably more expensive way back when, 2+ decades ago. If you wanted to get good in server management, you had to buy a beefy server and figure out how to get the server license. If you needed to get in networking, you had to see what you could do about buying a used router or switch and configure it. That investment for the user, it was considerable. But think about where we are today. Almost everything is virtualized. And so if you wanted to learn Azure, or you wanted to learn Google GCP, or you want to learn AWS, all that material, it's free. All you need is a good dedicated internet and your own time. And so it's really about time and attention when you want to focus. It has never been easier to learn technology. And so it's really up to you on how much time and commitment. It's like for me, if I wanted to have a better diet or better exercise, I got to put time in. I can't talk about exercising. I need to actually commit to doing it. Start with walks and evaluate running. Same thing with the diet. If I like French fries and I got to cut back on it, what do? I can't just keep eating French fries. I got to actually do the work. So if you want to learn security or learn the cloud or cloud security, even because those are heavy pieces of jargon, there's so much free material out there these days that the only thing stopping you is yourself. There's plenty of information out there, and start doing.
Yeah, Michelle, to Vince's point, we actually, the information being out there, and with what's happening across the board, in Hawaii, both commercially and in all industry for that matter, we actually created our own workforce development program that's geared around technology and commodity work, especially because of the pandemic. We were trying to figure out a way to help all the people that, or people that were dislocated, during the pandemic. And it seems to be working out for us, where we offer them paid on the job training, and you don't have to have a lot of experience, because the information's out there. The free stuff is great for sure, but then to ramp up and go get, an industry recognized certification that can help you get a permanent, equitable job. There's other training platforms that can help you do that too. So we've been seeing success. Again, it's the scalability and how many people we can take on. But I think there are other programs like that, across the board. I mean, the industry leaders are building their own curriculum, to help people get skilled quickly, because it is complicated. Cyber being one of the more complicated, arenas in technology, but that's it. It's not that it can't be done. You can definitely start somewhere. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity per what we described, what we're all talking about, on this call. So.
Oh, great, thanks. And if people want to learn more about it, Kelly, can they reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'll
absolutely.
throw everybody's email into the chat also. Last word on cybersecurity, if people take away one thing from you guys.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think probably the theme that's come across a lot is, if you don't try and do everything yourself, this day and age, there's a lot of great service providers, a lot of great help that you can just tap into those services, and, takes the effort off having to do everything yourself. So, take the benefit from that.
Thanks.
For me, again, engage, like Phil said, engage an SI. But nonetheless, look at what's out there. To Vince's point, there's a lot of framework instruction, like basic things you can do, right, to build a better cybersecurity foundation for your organization. So I think you start there, and there's a ton of information out there, which I think, Michelle, we can also probably share.
That'd be great.
My closeout message will apply to multiple levels of organizations. That is, as the meme goes, MFA all the things. Wherever there's an identity credential, do what we can to enable multi-step, multi-factor authentication and move from there. It's a huge learning experience. If you're really curious about getting stronger on the IT or the security side, learn how to do it for yourself. That way you can help support your own organization. And then that maybe you can use as a stepping stone towards a future career. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for sharing this knowledge and being on the panel. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to collaborating more in the future. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks you.
Thanks for your time. Had fun.
Take care.
Good. And with that, I would like to welcome Chris, our next speaker on the line.
Good morning.
Hello. I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself and get us started.
Perfect. Thank you, Michelle. My name is Chris Hein. I run the customer engineering organization for Google Cloud, specifically for the public sector in North America. So the states in the United States, as well as our friends up north in Canada. I'm coming to you today from Chicago, but I did attempt to at least come in the appropriate attire as best I could from my closet. So excited to spend some time with you all today. my goal today is really to try to talk through one specific story of how a fairly large entity went through this journey. And so I will do my best to share my screen here. Okay. Great. So I'm going to talk to you today about New York City Cyber Command, also known as NYC3. So if I accidentally slip into my jargon, please forgive me. That's the way that they know themselves, and as we work with them, that's what we've called them as well. So this is the City Cyber Command for all of New York City. So the problem and the challenge in front of New York City was as follows. New York City is one of the most complex IT environments in the world, bar none. And so, they have to protect over 300,000 city employees. They've got well over 400,000 endpoints, that be devices, workspaces, work machines, and servers, and 192,000 public IPs. And so what they found is, as they were working through a comprehensive review of the city's cyber hygiene and cyber health about 4 years ago, was while there was a centralized practice, all of the agencies had their own data, all the sources were not collaborating well with each other. There was no single pane of glass that could really be pointed to say whether or not they're currently secure. And so 4 years ago, they were instantiated from the mayor. And so they were dictated to say, hey, you're going to live slightly to the side, slightly parallel to central IT. And you're going to be responsible for, the cyber defense and incident response. And then they were also going to be kind of a advisory function for the city when it comes to things like all the cyber spending that they might be doing. So they came at it, and the city CISOs really started to look at it and say, okay, what do we need to log, right? What's out there that we need to start to accumulate and get an understanding of in terms of whether or not we're in a good place. And what they found was, you go to look at the MITRE charts and you realize you have to log a lot. There are a lot of elements that you need to pay attention to do cybersecurity particularly well. And when they were kind of looking through how much of this was logged today in their current environments, they really found a dearth of good source material to work off of. A lot of this would get stored and then immediately purged off because it was expensive and hard to keep all of this data for the long term. So they began their process of trying to identify, how are they going to build out a platform that could achieve the goals that they had in front of them of really keeping the city's overall infrastructure safer and help to do much better incident response. Their overall concept, and I like to give credit to Jeff Brown and Colin Ahern over from the New York City Cyber Command team for this analogy, was they determined that at their very baseline, what they needed to do was create a lighthouse. And what they meant by the lighthouse is, we heard a little bit from Phil and team earlier in this, that you can't, modern cyber defense is not building a bigger and bigger wall, right? And creating a castle that you can really, make sure that you've enforced the wall appropriately. So what Cyber Command was, their assumption was, there's a really good chance that multiple agencies, multiple areas inside of our remit have already been breached, right? There's already going to be threats that have made their way through the system. And so if we build our entire environment inside the same walls, we're effectively giving up the keys to the kingdom at the very beginning, right? If you think about the fact that if we've already been breached, if we make that assumption that there is no way we can trust the systems that already exist here, we need to be able to look from the outside in, and not only just from a retrospective perspective, but also trying to think through in the future, if there is an incident, if we have an outage that is fairly significant and takes down large chunks of our infrastructure, we need to be able to do incident response from something that sits outside of that incident response team. So their goal and their purpose was to build this lighthouse that could look in and shine a light into the castle. It could actually identify the problems and be able to be responsive, regardless as to whether or not there's an existing attacker in the system. So for them, that meant, most of New York City 4 years ago was still operating primarily on-prem, and some of the data centers operated and run by the city. And so they decided to look to cloud as a means of creating this lighthouse that would be able to look from the outside in. They kind of focused in on 4 core concepts when building this out. So one, they really wanted to be cloud native. And so I'll take you through some of the infrastructure on a future slide here, but they really wanted to as some of the points were made earlier, let the cloud providers do what they did best, right? And so if you really push a lot of the responsibility for the platform as a service rather than the infrastructure as a service, that allowed them to be more rapid in their ability to develop something new, get it out there, get it ready, do more identification. And so they really wanted to build off of this concept of being cloud native. The second and very important one was, as Phil mentioned, while we may not love the branding at all times, zero trust is the term that we use for this now. And so zero trust was something that they really wanted to focus themselves in on, and making sure that they could say that at least for their infrastructure, at least for the cyber command themselves, they would know that all of their core services were going to be based off zero trust. They also wanted to make it really modular. Their idea here was they wanted to build these pipelines that could each be used independent of each other, right? So one of the things that's been interesting watching them over the past 4 years is they've actually subbed out different pieces of their infrastructure while they've been able to continue to push forward with the mission without seeing any gaps in that, right? They've had different SIMs that they've been feeding their data into. And, when they switch those things out, the overall architecture doesn't change. It's just that one module that they were able to change. And they wanted to be fast and future focused, right? They wanted to make sure that they could handle things at scale for the long term, right? And, they did want to build with the concept of eventually getting to machine learning. I heard Vincent mention that ML, if you come in and somebody says ML is going to solve all your security problems, you should probably not take that meeting. I would agree with him on that. But they really did want to say, hey, this might be where we need to go. And so let's make sure we build for the ability to get there if it works out, right? If we can get to the point where we can automate more and more of the data collection, categorization, and identification, perhaps we can start to put that into a proactive ML system instead of a reactive system. So as they looked at all those core concepts, they did a full analysis. And I'll try not to make this too much of a commercial here, but they did end up going with Google to help them with that particular problem, which is obviously why I know what I know about it. And so what they really liked, and the reason they kind of came and they stuck with us was as they started to identify these 4 main tenets of what they were going to be doing. One was zero trust, which obviously Google initiated this entire thing with the Beyond Corp white paper, which you can take a look at. That was really Google's own journey down, after we had a major incident, we realized that we needed to do all of our security differently. And we published a white paper on that called Beyond Corp, which has been kind of adopted into zero trust. And so that was certainly something that they found interesting, was that they could tap into some of the key expertise that Google brings to bear in this particular environment. They also liked the fact that, most of Google's environment operates in this very serverless environment. And so they, as mentioned on the previous slide, they're planning on using Apache Beam, which is a data processing pipeline technology that is open source. Google had a really good, and has a really good way of doing that for them that allows it to be really flexible, where it gets bigger when there's more events to log, and then it can get smaller again as the events slow down, right? So during the periods where New York is seeing a tremendous amount of cyber traffic, the data flow pipeline can get bigger and expand. And then as it decreases and there's less incidents coming through, that pipeline can get smaller. And so that allowed them, public sector agency, obviously it's not unlimited funding. So being able to have something that was a little bit flexible in terms of how much usage would come through was really important to them. There's some good articles. We can post them into the chat here if you'd like to read them. There's also some other good videos from especially Colin, the CISO of New York City, has done a couple of really good webinars on this. So it's worth going and taking a look at that. But the great news, and the reason that I wanted to call this out, is that we have been operational with them for the last 4 years, and they have found great success being able to build out this platform. So this is not a, maybe this will work out kind of thing. This is we've had a lot of great success working together with New York City Cyber Command, and they've been able to really improve the overall security and operations and response times for the city. So I promised an architecture slide. I won't go too far into this, but I want to at least touch on what some of the key concepts that they brought into it were. So the first thing that they did was they did look at all their log sources. And so they found, when you go back to that MITRE slide of all the things that you have to log, what they kind of started with was, direct ownership of some agency data. And so they went to those specific agencies, they went to those key sets of data, and they started to try to identify what's going to be the fastest way for us to take the data from where it lives today, get it into our cloud environment so that we can start to analyze it and do something productive with it. And what they found was they actually found that it's faster to do some minimal enrichment of the data locally and then push that enriched data up to the cloud from there. And so they just would append a couple of fields so that it would be easier to sort once it hit the cloud processing pipelines. So there's this brief period of enrichment, and then it goes up into this ingest category. If you look at the ingest and parsing section of the slide here, if we were in person, I'd be waving my hands at the slide. So it goes into the ingest. The ingest is handled in Google's speak. We use a pub sub messaging bus kind of thing, right? You could use open source Kafka for this, but for them, they really looked at pub sub as one of the ways that Google kind of differentiates and makes sure that this process goes a little bit easier and smoother. That then, being a messaging bus, can bifurcate into multiple places, right? And so you can see there that it both does a replicator. So they have a pipeline that is looking for anything coming into this ingest period, and they're making sure that they get a true copy of all of that data as it comes through the pipeline, right? Before they go and do further enrichment in the rest of their pipeline, they wanted to capture that so they could rewind in time to go back and look at some of the raw data as it's coming across the pipeline, because they wanted to make sure that if something was messed up anywhere in this modular architecture, they had the ability to almost rewind back in time and grab that information at its beginning point again. So they replicated it all to a centralized repository, but it also flows through the flow control, which does further enrichment in the cloud, and then kind of gets parsed out into these other parts that are over on the right-hand part of the screen. In the right-hand part of the screen is really where the overall visualization, the ability to do monitoring, and all of that kind of investigative work happens. As I mentioned previously, they actually utilized more than a few different SIMs, things like Splunk and Exabeam and Humio. One of those was also Chronicle, so they also have a Chronicle instance that they feed into this, and so which is Google Cloud's player in that particular market. So they would sub these things out as it made the most sense, but they would build those out, and those were basically consumers of this overall data pipeline. So it would flow through the pipeline first. Once it was finished flowing through the pipeline, it would then be consumed by these different SIMs and dashboarding tools that were available for their investigators to look through when there was an incident. A couple other elements to the story here. One is, you'll notice there's third-party data sources in the upper left-hand corner. They had CrowdStrike, they had a bunch of other services, some of which were over on other clouds. And so they were consuming some of that over from a cloud-to-cloud, peer-to-peer network, and bringing that down into Google Cloud from there. And so they were using, they've got Office 365 environments, that they've got multiple environments that they're pulling data off of to bring it down into their overall Google Cloud environment. They also were very interested in making sure that they did everything in as clean of a CI/CD process as they could. They really wanted to use industry best practices there, so that as they're building this all from scratch, they did have the ability to really monitor their own supply chain and think some of those best practices that Phil talked about in his presentation. So they worked through all of those, and then they also built out their own zero trust environment, right? Not just assuming that Google Cloud was doing their zero trust environment, but also using, in the upper right-hand corner, you see this identity-aware proxy. So they made sure that they used these identity-aware and context-aware proxies, which is basically Google Cloud's way of helping you to do a zero trust environment that makes sure that as you are going to any element of their system, you are going to be doing trust and authority checks at every stage of the process. So one of the things that this meant for New York City Cyber Command was, when the pandemic happened, it's still happening, but when it first kind of came crashing down on New York City, they had to send all their employees home. Many environments were kind of stagnant for a while when that happened, but not New York City Cyber Command, because they had invested so strongly in being a zero trust environment that their employees' workflow was exactly the same, because they had absolutely no trust associated with their corporate network. So they didn't have to VPN into a specific network to be able to function. They were able to just open up their laptops and have access to the exact same tool chain that they always had, because they were using this best in breed technology that was already available for them. So what they were able to accomplish. So they have gotten to the point, they are getting billions of events, and they are getting them through in less than 10 milliseconds per event. So that means that from the time the IP is logged on a system somewhere inside of New York City's overall infrastructure, but from that point to the point where it is all the way through their entire pipeline to be able to be part of the investigative process, is less than 10 milliseconds. And so what's amazing about that, and again, one of the things that I would say has been a success factor for them, is that has expanded from when they started and they only had a few agencies' data coming to them, to the point where now they are seeing that billions of events, right? They went from millions of events to billions of events, and they've been able to do all of that on the exact same architecture without re-architecting anything, because they worked off of a lot of Google Cloud's serverless platforms versus doing it all from scratch, or doing it all on a more infrastructure as a service type platform versus a platform as a service type platform. So, final slide here. What are some of the things that I would say are things that y'all could learn from what New York City Cyber Command did? And given the fact that the caveats of Cyber Command has, a sizable budget, being New York City, they're a fairly sizable entity, and they had really good remit from the top down, and so the mayor was the one that instantiated the program. And so, but I do think there's a couple of things from their story that hopefully y'all can use in your businesses and your agencies that you're coming from. So the first lesson, just rewinding to that beautiful picture of the lighthouse that we started with, is you have to start to work off of the concept that you're, potentially in a breached environment. And if you're potentially in a breached environment, you need to be able to put yourself into a place to be able to do the discovery, to be able to really work through any cyber issues that might come up in something that can peer into that outside layer. So that'd be the first one, is make sure you are looking to create this lighthouse that allows you to go out and look at this. And to the points that the earlier panelists made, trust an SI and a cloud service provider that have already done a lot of the hard work on this, right? So don't try to roll your own in this particular case. This is going to be something that you're very much going to want to do with someone that's been there, done that. Second thing is volume. One of the big problems that we see over and over again, not just in New York City, but across the environment, is, we can't hold on to this much data, right? It costs a lot of money to continually store all of the data from all of the sources that are coming our way. This is where cloud is really, really great, right? Storing data on cloud is cheap, right? Now, you do need to be careful. And this was one of the things that Cyber Command did, was one of the reasons that I've heard from a lot of customers as to why they're throwing away their security data, is that when they work with their SIMs, and this isn't a shot at the SIMs, this is just the truth of it, is that those folks will charge for the data storage. Right? So if you're using a Splunk or an Exabeam or somebody from that perspective, you have to pay to keep that information available to you. So one of the things that Cyber Command did in that case was, rather than having all of that live on the hard drives available to those SIMs, they actually would put all of that into a long-term storage compartment on Google Cloud. It was actually in BigQuery, which is our data warehousing tool. But it was able to then be rewinded back into the SIM in the event that they needed it, right? So they build that pipeline to be reversible, so that if there was a time where they needed to be able to say, hey, I want to make sure, did we find this, we got hit by an IP range that looks like this. We want to rewind to 2 years ago and see whether or not this ever happened before, right? Being able to do that retrospective look back is really important, but only possible if you can do it effectively from a cost-effective strategy. So that's volume as well as cost. I kind of combined both of those there. And then the situational awareness. What they really wanted to do, and this is going to be true whether you're a business or whether you're in the public sector, you're likely working against multiple places that have security data that would be helpful to you. And so it's important to try to combine those data sources as best you can into something that gives you the situational awareness to make a relevant decision and make a relevant action come out of it. And then, as best you can, you want to do some rationalization and modernization, right? Because you are going to have existing tool sets that are out there doing parts of this, right? And the more you can start to centralize that, the more you can start to say, hey, we can pay for some of this new stuff that we want to do by starting to get rid of some of the incumbent tools that we might be using. But the more you can start to think of this as a singular function inside of your business or agency, the more that can help you. And then lastly, I think the panel and Phil did a good job talking about this, but what can you do to make a business justification? So Cyber Command, interestingly, they, as their agency has rolled on, they had to justify back to the city council that they should continue forward, right? Because mayors changed, and so as that was happening, they had to justify that this was worth keeping going, right? And so they were able to use a lot of the data and the metrics that they've created to create as a long-term agency inside the city. But it is something that, whether you're a business or whether you're an agency, you want to do your best to say, yes, we're going to invest time, we're going to invest money into this particular infrastructure, but here's what it prevents, right? Here's the things that I know I can do that I can start to help to prevent these types of whether it's ransomware, whether it's other attack surfaces that you're worried about. Really, what are the ways that you can use this for your overall protection? So with that, I'd love to open it up. If anybody has any questions, I know it was already a really great discussion with the panel. So if anyone does have any questions, I would be happy to address them. I can go on this topic or anything else folks want to chat about.
Thank you, Chris. I have a question.
Yeah.
Most challenging part of the project, was it hard to get people to lean in? Was it
yeah,
all of that?
it's a good question. The most challenging part for them, I would say, was almost certainly, agency buy-in. And so, it's one thing to say we've got this beautiful new environment that can process billions of events per second and all of that kind of cool mumbo jumbo. It's another thing to try to get someone to give you what they find to be their core, dirty laundry sometimes, right? And so for them, it's been a long process going agency by agency, but they've built that trust, right? They started where they had clear kind of top down, like, you have to give data here, right? And then they've reached out from there because there's lots of other places that they didn't have that top down kind of enforcement mechanism, but they had to be able to show that they had this valuable thing, right? And so the way that they did that was to start to say, not just that they'll help, but then that allowed that agency to decommission something that they've been working with in the past. And so they were able to show kind of a cost benefit for each individual agency to start to contribute their data to the overall repository.
And then for something like for a solution like this, is this something that you can share with other cities, agencies that are interested?
There are elements to it that they have open source, but there are also a lot of this is more of an architecture that we can reuse, and so there I would say we can certainly talk through how that architecture works, but so much of it is then going to be dependent on your log enrichment sources that kind of come from that left-hand side of the architecture. And so I'd also just advise, like, this is one of those where, again, if you've got a great partner that is your SIM that you're already working with or you trust, that's great. Just make sure you're using some of these same concepts that New York City Cyber Command was using, because you can build a lot of this out with a chronicle, right? And just simply use that SIM as your overall data repository that you're doing this information work out of. But you want to make sure that you do that in a way that is those four kind of core concepts of cloud native, modular, I'd have to go back to that slide to remember my other two.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Chris. Can I, would it be okay if I shared your slides with the group?
Yeah, I believe so. I will clean them up and send them over to you, Michelle, so you can share.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah,
oh, thank you so much for your time and for sharing that use case with us. That's awesome.
You bet. Thank you all for
Really appreciate it.
spending the time.